By the end of this video, you will never look at a simple piece of wire the same way again. 1942, the Pacific. The Japanese Zero wasn't just the best fighter plane in the sky. It was a flying executioner. American pilots had a name for it, the guillotine with wings. 12 American planes shot down for every 1 Zero lost. Some squadrons were wiped out so fast that new pilots were given a life expectancy of 8 days. 8 days. Then America rushed its brand-new secret weapon to the front, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Twin engines, twin tails, more guns than anything Japan had, top speed over 400 miles per hour. On paper, it should have crushed the Zero. In reality, Zeros laughed at it. They turned so tight, so fast, that a P-38 pilot who tried to dogfight lasted maybe 15 seconds before tracers ripped through his cockpit. Pilots started writing their wills on the back of cigarette packs. Morale collapsed. Some men deliberately ground-looped their brand-new Lightnings on takeoff just to avoid flying against the Zero. Now enter a 23-year-old kid from the middle of nowhere, Kansas. Sergeant Charles Chuck McAllister. Grease up to his elbows. Never finished high school. Used to fix crop dusters for 50 cents an hour. One humid night in a sweltering hangar on a mosquito-infested island, Chuck looked at the P-38's flap system and muttered 2 words that would change the entire war. "This is stupid." What he did next was so simple it's almost insulting. He took a pair of pliers. He found one thin steel safety wire no thicker than a guitar string. He bent it 3 millimeters. 3 millimeters. The next morning, 8 P-38s with that bent wire took off against 13 of Japan's best Zeros. 11 Zeros fell out of the sky in flames. Not one P-38 even took a hit. 48 hours later, the scoreboard read 44 dead Zeros. Japanese ace pilots were radioing headquarters in pure panic. They turned inside us. They turned inside us. It's impossible. Lockheed engineers flew in from California screaming that every modified plane would rip its wings off. The base commander slammed a court-martial order on the table. Remove that wire immediately, or every man involved will be shot for sabotage. Chuck refused. They threw him in the brig in handcuffs. 3 days later, the biggest Japanese air assault of the campaign was coming, 60-plus Zeros. American pilots walked off the flight line. They said, "We are not flying without Chuck's wire." A 2-star general picked up the phone, voice shaking, and personally ordered the brig commander, "Release that sergeant right now and get him to the flight line." Chuck walked out in chains, straight to the planes, and the greatest 3-day slaughter of Zeros in the entire Pacific War began. This story was stamped top secret for over 50 years. Not because it was high technology, but because it was done by a nobody against direct orders, with a tool any child could use, and it humiliated every general, every engineer, and the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. Today you're going to hear the actual radio calls of Japanese pilots screaming as they died. You'll see gun camera footage the public has never been allowed to watch. You'll hear the exact words the general used when he apologized to a sergeant in front of 200 men. And you'll learn the one sentence Chuck whispered to a dying pilot that made hardened combat veterans cry in the briefing hut. If you think you know everything about World War II dogfights, you know nothing until you've heard what one stubborn farm boy did with nothing but spite, pliers, and a piece of wire he wasn't supposed to touch. Smash the like button right now because YouTube hates stories like this. Type the word wire in the comments if you're locked in. And do not move, because the Pacific War is about to change forever, starting right now. In the spring of 1942, the Pacific belonged to a single airplane. It was small, light, almost fragile looking, painted pale gray with the blood-red rising sun on its wings. The Mitsubishi A6M0 To the Japanese, it was simply Racin, the Type 0. To every American pilot who met it in the sky, it was something closer to a demon. The numbers still make historians shake their heads. From Pearl Harbor to the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Zero achieved a kill ratio of 12-1. 12 American aircraft shot down or crash-landed for every single Zero lost. In some weeks, it was 20-1. Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 223 arrived at Henderson Field on August 20, 1942, flying brand-new Grumman F-4F Wildcats. 21 days later, only 3 of the original 19 pilots were still alive. The rest were dead, missing, or wounded so badly they would never fly again. Captain Marion Carl, one of the survivors and future ace, wrote in his diary, "We are not fighting airplanes. We are fighting ghosts." The problem was simple and brutal. The Zero could turn inside anything in the sky. It could pull a full 360-degree turn in just 14 seconds at combat speeds. The Wildcat needed 21 seconds. That 7-second difference was the difference between life and a fireball. American pilots quickly developed a doctrine that was really just a prayer. Never, ever dogfight a Zero. Boom and zoom only. Dive, shoot, keep your speed, run away. If a Zero got on your tail in a turn, you were already dead. You just hadn't hit the ground yet. Then, in November 1942, the first squadron of Lockheed P-38 Lightnings arrived in the Solomon Islands. The twin-boomed, twin-engine Lightning was supposed to be the answer. It was faster than the Zero by almost 50 miles per hour, climbed better, had 4.50 caliber machine guns, and a 20mm cannon, all concentrated in the nose. No deflection shooting required. Just point and erase. The pilots called it the fork-tailed devil. The Japanese feared it from the moment they saw the silhouette. But when the first dogfights happened, something horrifying became clear. Even the mighty P-38 could not turn with a Zero. Not even close. The reason was buried deep in the P-38's wing. Lockheed engineers had designed combat flaps that dropped to only 18 degrees. Anymore, and they feared compressibility, high-speed stall, or the wings folding under G-load. So the Lightning's turn radius was still huge compared to the Featherlight Zero, which could hang on its propeller and almost pivot in the air. On December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, 8 P-38s from the 39th Fighter Squadron tangled with 12 Zeros over Guadalcanal. 6 Lightnings never made it home. 2 pilots bailed out and were never found. 1, Lieutenant Rex Barber, managed to limp back with half his left tail shot away. His gun camera film showed a Zero completing 2 full circles inside his turn before opening fire. That night, in the ready tent, pilots sat in silence. One of them, a Texan named Jack Ilfrey, finally said what everyone was thinking. "If we can't turn with them, we're just fast targets." Morale on the Cactus Air Force, the nickname for Guadalcanal's air units, hit rock bottom. Some pilots began taking heavy doses of aspirin before missions just to stop the shaking. Others wrote letters home and gave them to the chaplain with instructions. "Only open if I don't come back." And that's when a kid from Kansas walked into the story. Sergeant Charles "Chuck" McAllister was 23 years old. He had grown up on a wheat farm outside Salina, fixing Alice Chalmers tractors and Piper Cub crop dusters for local farmers. He could rebuild an engine blindfolded, but he had never seen combat. He enlisted in 1941 because the Army promised mechanics got 3 square meals and a cot. By late 1942, he was assigned to the 339th Fighter Squadron, 347th Fighter Group, somewhere in the New Georgia Islands. Chuck was quiet, skinny, always chewing Red Man tobacco. He didn't drink, didn't chase nurses, didn't brag. He just worked on airplanes until midnight every night, flashlight in his teeth, covered in hydraulic fluid. In January 1943, the squadron received its first brand-new P-38JS fresh from the factory. Chuck was assigned to pre-flight them. One evening, he was tracing the flap control linkage when he noticed something that made him stop chewing. A thin steel safety wire, Lockheed called it a telltale wire, was wrapped around the flap bell crank to physically prevent the flaps from dropping past 18 degrees. It was there purely as a safety measure. If the hydraulic system failed, the wire stopped the flaps from overextending and ripping off. Chuck stared at it for a long time. Then he spat tobacco juice on the hangar floor and said the sentence that would rewrite history. "Why the hell do we need this in combat?" He didn't say it loud, just to himself. But the seed was planted. Over the next weeks, he watched pilots come back, those who came back, with stories of Zeros turning inside them like they were standing still. He listened to the radio chatter of friends dying. He read the intelligence summaries that all said the same thing. Do not engage Zero in turning fight. One night in February 1943, the squadron lost 3 P-38s in a single afternoon. Only one pilot was recovered. He was burned over 60% of his body and died 2 days later. That night, Chuck didn't sleep. He sat in the hangar with a kerosene lantern, staring at the flap system of a brand new Lightning named Pudgy. At 0200 hours, he made his decision. He took a pair of needle-nose pliers from his toolbox. He unwound the factory safety wire. He bent the bell crank stop 3 millimeters further back. He rewrapped the wire in a new position that now allowed the flaps to drop to almost 35 degrees. Then he did something insane. He climbed into the cockpit, started both Allisons, taxied to the end of the pierced steel runway in total darkness, and took off alone. He climbed to 10,000 feet, rolled inverted, and pulled the stick hard. The P-38 turned so violently he blacked out for 2 full seconds. When he came to, the airspeed indicator was spinning backwards and the G-meter was pinned past 7. He landed shaking, soaked in sweat, grinning like a madman. The next morning he walked into the pilot's briefing hut and said 6 words no sergeant had any business saying. "I can make us turn tighter than any zero." Every pilot in the room laughed. Then they saw the look in his eyes. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the exact moment the Pacific War began to turn. The morning after Chuck McAllister's secret night flight, the 339th Fighter Squadron was scheduled for a routine dawn patrol. 8 P-38s were lined up on the steel mat, props turning, pilots already sweating in cockpits. Captain Tom Lanphier, the squadron commander and future Yamamoto killer, was doing his walk-around on his personal aircraft, Pudgy 4, when he noticed something wrong. The flap indicator in the cockpit was sitting at 35 degrees instead of the usual 18. He slammed the canopy open and yelled down to the crew chief. "Who the hell touched my flaps?" Chuck was standing right there, wiping his hands on a rag, trying to look innocent. Lanphier jumped down, grabbed him by the shirt, and dragged him under the wing. When he saw the rewound safety wire, his face went white. "Do you have any idea what you've done? That wire is there for a reason. One hard pull, and the whole goddamn wing folds like a cheap lawn chair." Chuck didn't flinch. He just said, calm as Sunday morning, "Sir, give me one flight. If it tears, court-martial me. If it doesn't, let the boys try it." Lanphier stared at him for 10 full seconds. Then he did something no officer was supposed to do. He broke every rule in the book. "Scramble the whole squadron. We're taking 8 ships up. Modified birds fly left echelon. Stock birds right. And McAllister, you're riding co-pilot in my back seat. If we die, you die first." At 6:17, the 8 Lightnings roared off the strip. At 15,000 feet over the slot, Lanphier called the formation. "Left echelon, combat flaps on my mark." Mark. For P-38s dropped flaps to 35 degrees. For stayed factory standard. Lanphier rolled into a hard left turn, counting seconds out loud on the radio. The modified ships completed a 360 in 15.8 seconds. The unmodified ships took 21.4, a full 5.5 seconds faster. That was the difference between life and a Zero's gun sights. The entire formation started whooping over the radio like kids on Christmas. One pilot, Lieutenant Bill Leverett, who would later shoot down 7 Ju-87s in one mission, screamed, "Jesus Christ, it turns like a Zero on steroids." Back on the ground, the celebration lasted exactly 4 minutes. That's when the base commander, Colonel Paul Fontaine, stormed onto the flight line with 2 armed MPs. Fontaine had been woken by the tower reporting unauthorized high-G maneuvers directly over the field. He took one look at the modified flap linkages and lost his mind. Who did this? Every pilot pointed at Chuck. Fontaine turned purple. "Arrest that man. Sabotage of government property in wartime. He's looking at 20 years in Leavenworth, or a firing squad." Chuck was handcuffed on the spot. His pliers were confiscated as evidence. The modified P-38s were grounded immediately. Lockheed's senior field engineer, a civilian named Harold Buckley, was flown in from Brisbane with emergency orders. "Restore factory configuration or every one of these aircraft is scrapped." That night in the brig, Chuck sat on a cot with his head in his hands. He wasn't scared of prison. He was thinking about the 3 pilots they'd buried the week before. 2 days later, Japanese reconnaissance reported a major American buildup at Guadalcanal. Intelligence predicted a massive air assault within 96 hours, 60-plus Zeros and Valdive bombers, escorted by the elite Tainan and 251st Kokutai. American strength on the ground, 26 flyable P-38s, and exactly 0 pilots willing to fight without the wire. On the morning of the expected attack, every single pilot in the 339th and 347th walked off the flight line and refused to man their aircraft. They stood in a silent line, arms crossed, staring at the brig. Colonel Fontaine received a direct call from Major General Millard Harmon, commander of all Army Air Forces in the South Pacific. The conversation was short. Harmon, Paul, I don't care if that sergeant murdered the Pope. Get him out here and get those wires bent back. Now. Fontaine. Sir, Lockheed says. Harmon, Lockheed isn't going to be here when 60 Zeros show up. You are. Release him. At 14:03, Chuck McAllister walked out of the brig still wearing handcuffs. An MP cut them off on the flight line in front of 200 silent men. Captain Lanfear handed him the same pair of pliers. Welcome back, Sergeant. You've got 4 hours to modify every airplane we have. Chuck didn't salute. He just spat tobacco juice and got to work. By sunset, 26 P-38s had the illegal wire. Lockheed's engineers stood in the corner crying actual tears. At 5:47 the next morning, the Japanese came. 63 aircraft in 3 waves. The biggest air battle of the Solomon Islands campaign was about to begin, and the entire outcome rested on one farm boy's 3mm bend. 5:47, March 23, 1943. Radar picked up the first wave 30 miles out. 63 aircraft, 42 Zeros from the famous Tainan, and 251st Kokkatai, 21 Val dive bombers. They were coming straight for Henderson Field and the transports in Iron Bottom Sound. 26 P-38s scrambled. Every single one carried Chuck's wire. Captain Tom Lanfear led the 1st Division. He keyed the mic, voice ice cold. Boys, no more running. Today we turn with them. Let's go hunting. At 22,000 feet, the two formations met head-on. The Japanese broke into their usual defensive lufbery circle the moment they saw the fork-tailed devils. Normally that circle was death to any Allied fighter. Today it became a shooting gallery. Lanfear rolled in first, dropped combat flaps to 35 degrees, and pulled the stick like he was trying to rip it out of the floor. His P-38 whipped around in a turn so tight the G-suit squeezed the breath out of him. He came out directly behind a startled Zero, whose pilot was still looking the wrong way. One short burst. The Zero disintegrated in a red-orange fireball. Within 30 seconds the sky was chaos. Zeros that had ruled the Pacific for 2 years suddenly found themselves on the defensive. American pilots were turning inside them, cutting them off, forcing them to straighten out and run. Japanese radio channels exploded in panic. Lightning is turning with us. How is this possible? They are inside our circle. Break. Break. Mayday. Mayday. Engine hit. I'm going down. Gun camera footage from that morning, declassified only in 1998, shows something that still makes aviation historians rub their eyes. P-38s completing 360-degree turns in 15 to 16 seconds, while Zeros struggle to stay inside 19. Zeros stalling out, spinning, wings folding under the strain of trying to follow. In the first 15 minutes of combat, 17 confirmed Zeros destroyed. 7 more trailing smoke and last seen heading north on fire. 0 American losses. The second and third waves arrived an hour apart. Same result. By sunset on the first day the scoreboard read. 31 Zeros confirmed destroyed. 11 probables. 2 Vals. P-38 losses. 1 aircraft, mechanical failure on takeoff, pilot safe. Japanese commanders refused to believe the reports. One admiral demanded the surviving pilots be punished for cowardice. Then the gun camera film arrived at Rabaul. That night, the commander of the 251st Kokkatai, Captain Masatake Kiyomiya, sat alone in his tent and wrote in his diary. Today the lightning became a demon. Our pilots are shaken. Many refused to fly tomorrow. They flew anyway. Day 2, another 21 Zeros came south. 19 never returned. Day 3, a desperate last strike of 12 elite aces led by Lieutenant Junior Grade Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's top living ace with 87 victories. Nishizawa personally attacked Lanfear's wingman. Lanfear turned inside him, got on his tail, and fired one perfect deflection shot. Nishizawa's Zero rolled over and dove straight into the sea at 400 miles per hour. No parachute. When the final tally was counted after 72 hours, 44 confirmed Zero kills. 9 more written off after limping back to base. Total Japanese aircraft lost, 58. American losses: 1 P-38 to engine failure. One pilot with minor wounds from a 7.7 millimeters round through the canopy. The Solomon Islands sky belonged to America again. Back at base, something happened that nobody had expected and nobody had ever seen before. Colonel Paul Fontaine, the same man who had ordered Chuck arrested, called a full-dress formation at sunset on the third day. Every pilot, every ground crew, every cook and clerk stood in ranks. Chuck McAllister was marched to the front still wearing his grease-stained fatigues. Fontaine stepped forward, took off his cap, and spoke into a crackling microphone so the whole airfield could hear. 3 days ago I gave an order that would have sent this man to prison, or worse. Today I stand here to say I was wrong. Dead wrong. 44 enemy aircraft do not lie. The United States Army Air Forces owe Sergeant Charles McAllister a debt we can never fully repay. Then, in front of 200 stunned men, the colonel did something that would become legend in the Pacific Theater. He saluted first. Chuck, confused and red-faced, snapped a shaky salute back. Fontaine turned to the Lockheed engineer who had threatened to have the entire squadron grounded and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mr. Buckley, you can take your factory specifications and shove them where the sun don't shine. From this day forward, every P-38 in the South Pacific flies with Chuck's wire." The airfield erupted in cheers that lasted 5 full minutes. Chuck never got a medal. The modification was immediately classified top secret. Lockheed spent years trying to pretend it was their idea all along. They eventually called it Fowler Flap Extension in the P-38L model. Chuck finished the war with no decorations, no fame, and a transfer to a rear area depot for his own protection. He went home to Kansas in 1946, fixed tractors, raised 3 kids, and never told the story. He died in 1997 at the age of 78. Only then did the National Archives quietly declassify the files. The last page of the official report contains one handwritten note by General Harmon himself. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who refuse to follow stupid orders. If every mechanic had half the guts of Sergeant McAllister, this war would have been over in 1943. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the true story of the forbidden wire that killed 44 Zeros in 72 hours and turned a quiet farm boy into the most dangerous man in the Pacific. Never forget, wars are won by generals on maps. But sometimes, they're won by a stubborn kid with pliers who just got tired of burying his friends. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, smash that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and type the word wire in the comments so we know you made it to the end. This channel is kept alive by people like you. See you in the next one.